In a lab outside Chicago in 1980, a Japanese researcher named Hiroyuki Sumi tested 173 foods trying to dissolve a blood clot on a glass plate. Nothing worked. The 174th was a spoonful of fermented soybeans, the same breakfast his grandmother had eaten his whole life. The clot was gone in 18 hours, but the compound inside that dish didn't stop at clots. It also interfered with the exact enzyme your liver uses to manufacture cholesterol, the same one every statin on the market is built to block. Japan has one of the lowest rates of death from heart disease anywhere in the developed world. That's not a folk claim. It's a pattern researchers have tracked for decades, and genetics alone can't explain it. Japanese Americans who switch to a Western diet lose most of that protection within a single generation, which means the DNA isn't doing the heavy lifting. Something in the way Japan actually eats day after day is carrying weight that a pill usually gets credit for. At the center of it sits a food most Western stomachs can't get past. Natto is soybeans fermented for about 24 hours with a bacteria called Bacillus subtilis. The texture is stringy, closer to melted cheese pulled apart than anything you'd call a bean. The smell has been compared to old socks left in a locker, and even inside Japan, it's a dish people either grew up loving or actively avoid at the breakfast table. But buried in that sticky mess is an enzyme called nattokinase, and it's the reason a fermented breakfast food ended up cited in cardiology journals instead of just sitting in a grocery aisle. This is where it turns from a folk remedy into an actual mechanism. Nattokinase doesn't just thin the blood, which is the effect it's mostly known for, if it's known for anything at all. It also binds to an enzyme called HMG-CoA reductase, the rate-limiting step in your liver's entire cholesterol production line. Statins work by blocking that same enzyme. That is the whole mechanism behind a multi-billion-dollar drug category built around slowing one single choke point in your liver's chemistry. Nattokinase appears to lean on that same choke point, not from a prescription pad, but from a bowl of fermented beans that predates the pharmaceutical industry by roughly 1,000 years. So does any of this actually move the numbers, or is it another supplement aisle legend that falls apart the moment someone runs a real trial? A clinical study followed 1,062 adults for 12 months, every one of them with elevated cholesterol, early plaque buildup in the carotid artery, or both. All of them took nattokinase daily, most at a dose of 10,800 fibrinolytic units. After a year, LDL, the number your doctor circles in red on the lab report, had dropped by an average of 18.2%. Plaque size in the carotid artery had shrunk by 36.6%. Those aren't rounding error numbers, not close. Researchers who study this compare a result that size to a genuine lifestyle overhaul or to a low-intensity statin. But before you throw out a prescription bottle over that, there's a catch buried in the same research, and it's the part most videos on this topic conveniently skip. That 10,800 unit dose everyone keeps citing is roughly 3 to 5 times higher than what a typical nattokinase supplement on the shelf actually contains. Earlier trials that used the standard 2,000 to 4,000 unit dose produced weaker, sometimes inconsistent results. A separate 26-week study using 6,000 units did find real reductions in total cholesterol, LDL, and triglycerides, along with a rise in HDL, the kind of cholesterol you actually want more of. The pattern researchers keep circling back to is a dose-response relationship, meaning the bottle sitting on a wellness influencer's desk at 2,000 units almost certainly isn't producing what the headline study did. There's a second asterisk worth naming out loud. That 1,062-person study wasn't a randomized, placebo-controlled trial. It followed people who chose nattokinase as their own health strategy, not people randomly assigned to take it or take a sugar pill instead. A drop of that size is hard to wave away, but it also means nattokinase hasn't been tested head-to-head against statins in the kind of rigorous trial that gets a drug approved by a regulator. Nobody has proven it replaces medication, full stop. What the evidence actually supports is narrower and more useful than a miracle cure headline. A real lever on cholesterol, not a myth, not a switch either, a lever. Natto isn't the only piece of this. Walk through almost any home in Japan in the morning, and you'll find a second habit sitting right next to the rice cooker: green tea. A meta-analysis pooling 20 separate clinical trials and more than 1,400 participants found that green tea catechins, taken daily for anywhere from 3 to 24 weeks, produced a modest but real drop in both total and LDL cholesterol. That number alone won't turn heads. Stack a mild, repeatable effect from tea on top of a stronger one from fermented soybeans, and you start to see how a country's death rate from heart disease can drift lower without anyone in it ever taking a pill for it. There's a third habit worth naming, and this one has the strongest evidence of the three. The JELIS trial, run in Japan on more than 18,000 patients with high cholesterol, split people into two groups. One took a statin alone, the other took the same statin plus 1,800 milligrams a day of EPA, the omega-3 fat concentrated in oily fish like mackerel and sardines, both of which show up on Japanese tables far more often than they show up on Western ones. The EPA group had 19% fewer major coronary events. 19%. That trial wasn't a supplement forum anecdote. It was large, randomized, and published in a major medical journal, and it's part of why EPA now ships as an actual prescription drug in some countries, not just a fish oil capsule at the pharmacy checkout. Put the three pieces next to each other: fermented soybeans hitting the same enzyme as a statin, tea catechins nudging LDL down a few points at a time, and fish fat that measurably prevents heart attacks in a trial the size of a small town, and Japan's low heart disease numbers stop looking like a mystery and start looking like arithmetic. So how does a country build something like this into ordinary life instead of a health kick that fades by February? In Okinawa and across much of Japan, natto isn't a supplement you remember to take at 9 in the morning with a glass of water. It's just what's on the table, spooned straight over warm rice, stirred with a raw egg and a splash of soy sauce, eaten most mornings the exact way cereal gets poured in a Western kitchen. That daily repetition is probably doing more than any single 10,800 unit capsule ever could on its own, because consistency, not intensity, is the variable cardiovascular researchers keep landing on when they try to explain outcomes that play out over decades instead of weeks. None of the three habits above exist in a vacuum either. The Okinawa Centenarian Study, which has tracked some of the longest-lived people on the planet for decades, kept landing on the same quiet background variable behind all of it. A traditional Japanese diet simply carries less saturated fat than a Western one to begin with, built around rice, vegetables, soy, and fish instead of red meat and butter, so cholesterol never has as steep a hill to climb in the first place. There's also a phrase Okinawan elders use before eating, hara hachibu, which roughly translates to eating until you're 80% full instead of stuffed. It sounds too simple to matter, but portion size changes how much saturated fat and refined carbohydrate a body has to process at every single meal. That means the nattokinase, the catechins, and the EPA aren't fighting a flood every day. They're working with a smaller, more manageable amount of the thing they're trying to clear. That's the part a headline about one miracle food always leaves out. It was never one trick. It was the background diet plus 3 specific compounds layered on top of it, each one chipping away at a different part of the same problem. If the smell is a deal breaker, and for most non-Japanese palates it is, the supplement industry has built an entire workaround. Japan's Nattokinase Association, JNKA for short, certifies products for enzymatic activity, purity, and the removal of vitamin K. And that last part matters more than it sounds like it should. Vitamin K helps blood clot, which is the exact opposite of what someone taking nattokinase for its clot-dissolving effect is usually going for. A poorly made supplement can leave enough vitamin K behind to quietly cancel out the reason someone bought it. Worth checking the label. You don't need a trip to Tokyo to try any of this. Frozen natto shows up in the refrigerated section of most Asian grocery stores in the West, usually a few small plastic tubs for under $3, packet of soy sauce and mustard included. Green tea and mackerel are even easier to find. The barrier here was never availability, it was unfamiliarity and maybe the smell. Here's the part that should actually change how you use any of this if you decide to use it at all. Nattokinase is an enzyme that affects clotting. That's the exact mechanism that made it famous in the first place, the main event, not a footnote. If you're already on a blood thinner like warfarin, or even taking daily aspirin, stacking nattokinase on top without your doctor knowing turns a wellness habit into a bleeding risk sitting quietly inside a capsule. Scheduled for surgery, most clinicians will tell you to stop it weeks in advance, same reason. And if you're currently on a statin, nothing in this video is a script for quitting it. Every study cited here measured nattokinase alongside people's existing medical care, not as a replacement for a cardiologist's prescription pad. The honest version of this video ends with a conversation with your doctor, not a supplement order placed at midnight. What's remarkable, though, is the mechanism itself, not the marketing built on top of it. An enzyme fished out of stringy fermented soybeans in a lab outside Chicago in 1980 turned out to be leaning on the exact biochemical choke point that the pharmaceutical industry spent decades and billions of dollars engineering statins to hit. Nobody designed it to do that. Bacteria fermenting soybeans in Japan for roughly 1,000 years weren't optimizing for LDL particle counts. They were just making breakfast, generation after generation, without a single research grant behind it. The science caught up centuries later and found the target had been sitting in a bowl the entire time. So here's the question actually worth sitting with once the video ends. If a fermented food that predates modern medicine by a millennium is landing on the same biological target as a drug category that took decades and billions of dollars to build, how much of what actually helps us is still just sitting on a plate somewhere, unstudied, because nobody with a research budget has bothered to ask the right question about it yet? Is the next real advance always going to come out of a lab, or has some of it already been on the table the whole time, waiting? Picture what that morning actually looks like end to end. Rice in the bowl, natto stirred with a raw egg, and a splash of soy sauce spooned over the top, a piece of grilled mackerel on the side, and green tea instead of a second cup of coffee. No pill organizer, no shake, just breakfast, repeated for years instead of attempted for a week and abandoned. That's the actual method behind the title of this video, and it was never going to fit on a bottle label, because a pattern doesn't sell the way a product does. So the real question isn't whether a Japanese fix for cholesterol exists, it's whether you're willing to trade a habit that shows results over months for the fantasy of a switch that flips overnight, because the second one doesn't exist and never has. Not in Tokyo, not anywhere. Was it ever going to be a secret pill, or was it always going to be something slower and less exciting than that? Something you'd actually have to keep doing. Talk to your doctor before changing anything, especially if you're on a blood thinner or a statin already, since the biggest risk in any of this is doing it alone without someone watching your numbers. If this kind of breakdown, real studies, real caveats, no miracle cure nonsense is what you actually want more of, the rest of Japan's everyday habits are worth pulling apart the exact same way, one study at a time, in the next video.